Who are we voting for? Meet the candidates. Who Are We Voting For was created so we could understand who the candidates are and what they are about. This is not an endorsement for any candidate. This is for the voter to be more educated about who we're voting for.
Hey, my name is William Anderson, and I'm the owner of Pittsburgh's finest auto body. I'm William Anderson, also known as Lil Man. I was born and raised in Homewood. I own a body shop that I've owned for 33 years. I'm the grandson of Evelyn D. Richardson, who was the first African-American elected to the Democratic National Committee. I went to, like I said, I was born and raised in Homewood to a single mother of three. I'm a lifelong resident. I went to Belmar Elementary School. I used to be the paper boy in Homewood. That was my first job. When I was about 7 years old, I became a paper boy. It was treacherous delivering papers in Homewood, especially in the wintertime, and especially when I was like almost 3 foot tall and like 50 pounds wet. So, dragging a sleigh up and down the hills of Homewood, delivering papers was a challenge, but it taught me grit, and it taught me work and life experience. So, from there, I went to Belmar Elementary School, where, I started my speaking career at the age of 6, as I did the Martin Luther King Jr. speech, the I Have a Dream speech. So my first speech that I did, I had to memorize the speech. As a child, it was kind of difficult, but, I worked at it and practiced. So then, I did this first speech at Westinghouse, High School. And I was so short, I had to stand on the box because I couldn't see over the podium. So, after that speech, I got a standing ovation, and I never had to try out for another play again, in my entire, school career after that. And it actually turned into a statewide program where we traveled across the state and, and went to different schools. And I did, continue to do the speech and things like that. So that taught me a little bit about our history and the activism and the importance of the civil rights movement in our community. So, from there I went on to Rasenstein Middle School, where, it was a nice environment because then, at Belmar, I only had, were basically all African Americans. So Rasenstein was my first experience with a multicultural students in a multicultural environment outside of, being born and raised in the Homewood Brushton community. So, from Rasenstein, I was always a good student. I always got, straight A's or made the honor roll. So when I was leaving the 6th grade in Rasenstein and going on to trying to choose a high school, although I lived right around the corner from Westinghouse High School, I didn't go to Westinghouse, right? So most people think because I'm from Homewood that I went to Westinghouse. But I didn't go to Westinghouse because, I tell people I was too smart to go to Westinghouse. It's because I went to Perry Traditional Academy, because at that time, Perry was a magnet school and you had to get accepted into Perry. So because I had good grades, I graduated in the top percent of my class in the 6th grade, I got accepted to Perry Traditional Academy and went on to the north side to attend Perry for 4 years. And at Perry, I got life skills, and I got, more associated with basically, whites that I never even had any type of relationship with. I had my first white friend, Eddie Auer, that I met at Perry Traditional Academy, because I took, besides my scholar classes, I took carpentry for 2 periods a day, which allowed me to be able to basically build a house, because, I got skills training, and I was the only African American, that took carpentry, and I had carpentry 2 periods a day for 4 years. We actually built a house inside of our carpentry class, and I did a lot of, and I was able to make some money on the side also, because I made different things for people. Like I made rocking horses. I made plaques for people that were on the basketball team, because our basketball and our football team in Perry, we were the best all 4 years that I went to Perry. We won city and state titles in both basketball and football, all 4 years that I was in school. So then, once I graduated from Perry, I graduated in the top 10% of my class from Perry, and I went on to Penn State University. So I went to Penn State McKeesport, in McKeesport now. It's now Penn State Eastern Allegheny, I believe it's called now. So that just gave me a lot more better outlook on life and a lot more broad perspective of the world. Because during, when I was attending Perry, it was at the time when there was a lot of racial tensions in the country, and when Rodney King got pulled over and got beat up by the police officers. So during those riots and things like that, we started our Black Student Union. So, and that's when I really got involved with activism and student and government and things like that, because I was the first African American on the Penn State Student Government Association at Penn State in McKeesport. So during that time, I was able to fight for things that we as in our dorm, we as a community at Penn State needed, as Penn State wasn't really and still isn't really a diverse school, especially not in McKeesport. So, from then I went on to Penn State, and then, I got in some trouble when I was going to Penn State. So I caught a felony case, so I had to drop out of school. But then I went back paying myself. So then, from there, I had to return back to Homewood once I could no longer get financial aid because of my felony. And that's when I started my body shop. Okay, so I'm running to be the next ever representative of the 24th Legislative District because, one, I'm the only candidate that was born and raised, in our district, and I have the greatest knowledge and experience of, what it's like to live in the 24th Legislative District, being born and raised in the district, and I have the closest connection with the residents in the community and know the needs and the wants and the concerns, of our community. And also I have the greatest experience as I've been involved in politics for over 30 years. Right, and not just on the political side, being a Democrat, being the first African American elected to the Young Democrats of Pennsylvania in the history of the Democratic Party, currently being the only African American male and the first in the history of the party to be elected from our senatorial district out of 33 members that represent Allegheny County on the Democratic State Committee. So being a part of all of the nonpartisan organizations, BPEP, Fair Districts PA, Moms Demand Action, and Ceasefire, I have a dual experience, both political and nonpartisan, in lobbying and going to Harrisburg and fighting for issues that our community most concerned about and affects our community the most. So I am the most qualified, both politically and nonpartisan, to bring change and make a difference in our community. So, with my broad range of experience, currently being the chair of the Allegheny County Democratic Black Caucus and the chief of staff of the Democratic National Committee Black Caucus, that I, have the lineage and I have the legacy to be able to move our community forward, both the knowledge to write and pass legislation that will affect our community in a positive way, to be able to use my connections that I both inherited and that I built myself to be able to move our community and return the resources that our community direly needs. Well, my qualifications, as I said, range from my over 30 years experience. As I said, my grandmother, Evelyn D. Richardson, was one of the first African Americans elected to the Democratic National Committee, and for over 30 years, basically since 1990, about 91, 92, I've attended both Democratic State Committee and Democratic National Committee State Committee meetings, with my grandmother. And when I got involved and started going to meetings with my grandmother, I wasn't taken to meetings to get involved with politics. I was taken to meetings to, assist my grandmother because my mom didn't want her to travel by herself as she was getting up in age. So during those years, going all the way back, all I did was, volunteer for the Democratic Party at the meetings. I did everything from credentialing to setting up meeting spaces to putting literature together, to putting up signs, to handing out lit, to steaming and setting up the American flag, to assisting in bringing the color guard and make sure the color guard is taken care of to be able to open up meetings. So, and also, as the first African American elected to the Young Democrats of Pennsylvania, I used, my influence through the Young Democrats to help rebuild the Young Democrats of not just of Pennsylvania, but the Young Democrats of America. Because when we joined and started going to meetings as Pennsylvania, we were one of the largest, congregations. And during my term as a member of the Young Democrats of Pennsylvania, I diversified the Young Democrats of Pennsylvania for the first time in history, because normally it was an all-white organization, right? There were no African American, there were few women, and there were absolutely no minorities involved. So because of my influence with, thanks to the history and the legacy of my grandmother, I was able to bring a coalition and bring more African Americans into the organization, which helped us, broaden and diversify the Young Democrats of America. And also, on my nonpartisan level, I'm able to combine those political and nonpartisan skills that I was taught to be able to cross the aisles and to be able to fight issues, not as a Democrat, but as a citizen of the United States and of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So there's so much hate and negativity and talking about the other sides, I will be able to tone down the rhetoric and be able to move past it and work with legislators based on the concerns of the constituents of the 24th Legislative District. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, I have to represent everybody, and it shouldn't matter, who you love, how you worship, or or what party you're from. Everyone deserves equal justice under the law. As a candidate for state representative in the 24th Legislative District, if someone was to ask me what were the main issues that are affecting my legislative district, I would say that my main issues is, affordability, as we know that everything is, nothing is affordable anymore. Whether it's housing, whether it's gas, whether it's childcare, whether it's food, all of the costs of everything is going up. While the legislature has increased its own salary by 3% every year, the minimum wage has not been increased in Pennsylvania for over 25 years. And we all know that if minimum wage kept up with the cost of living increase, it would be around $23.50, today. Now, and I tell a story that in September, I just moved my daughter from Pittsburgh to Georgia, right? When she left Pittsburgh, she was making $10 an hour. As soon as she got to Georgia, her salary nearly doubled. And today she's been there for less than a year, and her salary is next month will go up to $30 an hour, and she's already the manager of Burlington Coat Factory. And in Georgia, she has all of her bosses are African American women. And she called me one day and said, "Dad, all of my bosses are African American women." And it was a shell shock to her because she had never seen that before, right? She's 34 years old. She lived in Pittsburgh for 33 years of her life, and she had never had an African American female boss her entire life. She'd never even seen African Americans in a position that they are in, in Georgia. So we, as citizens of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the 24th Legislative District, we shouldn't have to move our children out of town for them to live a better life. We should have legislators that are fighting every day in Harrisburg to make the conditions here in our legislative district, so that the families here can raise their kids, and our kids aren't, one, being gentrified out of their communities, and second, being forced out of their communities because they don't have proper health care, right? They don't have a steady employment where they can earn a living wage without having to work 2 or 3 jobs. We talk about our kids, going wild and things like that, but I believe there is no such thing as a bad child. There are just children and people that make bad decisions. So if we provide the resources and activities and things for these kids to stay out of trouble, we put the skills and the trades back into our high schools. We have over 20,000 abandoned properties in our community that aren't on the tax rolls. So if we were able to rehab these properties, by both putting the youth bill back into our communities, giving these kids a job, and adults too, jobs and opportunity to rehab these communities and put them back on the tax rolls and turn the renters into property owners. And that's another thing that has hurt our community so desperate, as we had one of the highest property ownership in the entire county. So now everything is going backwards. So instead of our community improving over the years, our community is only getting worse, and people make excuses and want to point the blame game. So I will be a legislator that will not do that. We'll be able to work in for real sensible legislation that will help to improve the conditions of our community and improve the lives of everyday residents. Hello, my name is William Anderson, and I'm asking for your vote now up until May 19th at 8 p.m. to be your next state representative of the 24th Legislative District. I am the best candidate and most qualified candidate to represent you in the state legislature because of my over 30 years experience and relationships that I've both inherited and that I've built both locally, statewide, and nationally with representatives and elected officials across the country to be able to return resources to our 24th Legislative District, because everything is just too unaffordable. From the exorbitant cost of housing, from the lack of development in our community, to the high rate of unemployment. In our legislative district, we incarcerate more African American males per capita than anywhere else in the entire country. This is unacceptable. We need to pass legislation so that those incarcerated are properly given the resources to have a defense because this is one of the only counties in the entire country where the state does not provide indigent resources to the public defender's office. And this is the reason a lot of our people are still incarcerated. We need to pass legislation so that we can prevent judges from holding our people in jail on detainers, where most of the time that we know that the average person serves more time in jail on a detainer than if they had been convicted of the crime that they have been charged with. We also need to tax the rich. We need to make the rich and the nonprofits pay their fair share so that our community is not left with the burden of housing and lack of employment. We need to raise the minimum wage, because we all know had the minimum wage kept up with the cost of living, the minimum wage would be around $23.50 today. And it's unacceptable that every state surrounding our Commonwealth has a higher minimum wage than we do, and has been able to work together to raise the minimum wage for the everyday citizen. My name is William Anderson, and I am asking for your vote May 19th to be your next state representative of the 24th District. Remember, Will works for you. It's time to put the people on the outside in and people on the inside out. Thank you for your vote.